Should economic growth be prioritized over environmental sustainability? Economic growth is essentially defined as an increase in the GDP of a country and hence production of goods and services. That makes economic growth one of the essential ingredients of ensuring a national economy moves on to development, a raise in standards of living and, in turn, poverty reduction and overall societal development. In contrast, environmental sustainability is the preservation of the natural environment and natural resources for generations to come. This important concept does not only apply to the national setting, but even on an international level. So mostly there exists a trade-off. Fast economic growth is often an outcome of environmental exploitation, whereas sustainability often imposes limits and regulations on industries, thereby hampering short-term profits. Environmental sustainability cannot be compromised if we are to stop irreversible damage being inflicted on the ecosystem, which in turn means climate change and the prevention of future generations benefiting through economic development. A middle ground must surely be pursued, one whereby through sound policies designed for sustainable development and green economies within the capitalist system, prosperity and planetary health can coexist. Economic opportunity in all its glory has turned lives around. Since the 1980s, for example, the pace of GDP growth in China has been nothing short of phenomenal. The latter has far lifted over 800 million people from extreme poverty. Countries such as Vietnam and South Korea have followed a similar pattern in just a few years and undergone transformations to be leading global players. This is due to paying off for the economy and living standards. High economies generate enormous revenues which fund life-raising public services, infrastructure, and ironically, environmental endeavors. Green technology comes at a price and huge investments are needed to build renewable energy grids, carbon capture and electric transport which struggling economies will never afford. Perhaps therein lies the truism that economic growth via environmental degradation would soon become a ticking time bomb. Prosperity is not the only thing achieved with China's industrialization. Each step in the path with prosperity went almost hand in hand with the other. The pang of toxic air pollution so dragonish that in some cities, breathing the air amounts to smoking several cigarettes a day. It has poisoned rivers, eroded farmland, and driven biodiversity to the brink. In Brazil, Amazon, deforestation is often qualified as an economic necessity. After all, cattle ranching and soybean farming brings in billions. But what happens if, at least for the short term, the lungs of the planet collapse? Water shortages and unpredictable rainfall are making farming impossible. The short-term profits derived through environmental exploitation come back to haunt economies in the harshest way. This is not a hypothetical cautionary tale, it is already happening. The collapse of the Newfoundland cod fishery in 1992 due to overfishing put 30,000 people out of work overnight. An entire industry wiped out by the greed of short-term profit-seeking. And there's just one example salvaged with similar stories across deforested rainforests, drained wetlands, and overexploited mining towns worldwide. The naysayers maintain that an emphasis on sustainability will stifle development, particularly in developing countries. They will argue that industrialization and resource extraction are necessary evils, but then how will countries ever be able to build the wealth needed to invest in clean energy and sustainable practices? African countries find themselves in this brutal dilemma. The mineral wealth of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is the world's second largest, would yield billions of dollars if exploited in timbers and minerals. But then at what cost? Deforestation would accelerate, fostering droughts, loss of biodiversity, and uncertainty in economic development. The old notion of economic growth and sustainability as two competing forces must therefore be abandoned. Green economies are no utopian ideal. In many cases, they are now proving to be very profitable. Just in the renewable energy sector, there are more jobs than in fossil fuel development in countries like the US and China. Solar and wind energy, which once competed for marginality or skimming past coal, is now surprisingly affordable. Prospects for sustainable development, ecotourism, regenerative agriculture, and circular economies are finding increasing acceptance as truly sustainable alternatives to destructive economic models, including in developing countries. Costa Rica is a great example, a small developing nation that rejected fossil fuel dependency and went on to invest in renewable energy decades ago. Almost all its electricity now comes from renewables, and the flourishing ecotourism sector is making substantial contributions to its GDP. The situation in this context contrasts to that of oil-rich Venezuela, whose dependence on fossil fuels has led to a catastrophe economically and environmentally. That very evidently is a wiser choice for a long-term growth. Some skeptics say that capitalism is inherently incompatible with a sustainable world. After all, profit-making enterprises concentrate on the short term, squeezing their costs. They do this by exploiting nature whenever possible. ExxonMobil knew about climate change for decades, but decided to drill because that was more profitable. Fast fashion profits from cheap labor, in many cases using exploitative means such as child labor in sweatshop factories, and cheap clothes, which landfills and waterways choke with garment waste. In the absence of stringent regulations, businesses will always take the path of least resistance. That said, capitalism is not a monolith. It is dynamic. New market incentives engender changes in business models. The EU Green Deal is for reshaping capitalism to reward sustainable innovation and punish pollution. When consumer demand and policy incentives align, companies like Tesla have demonstrated that green markets can thrive within a capitalist system. The problem is not capitalism, it is the outdated regulations that prioritize extraction over regeneration. Governments could put right environmental costs.